Oregon football has brought in a lot of new talent from the transfer portal in these last two cycles, and we're going to be taking a look at which group is going to leave the bigger impact on today's episode of the Ducks Dish Podcast. And we're back like we never left. Oregon fans, what's going on? How you living? Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of the Ducks Dish Podcast. I'm your host, Max Torres. Make sure you guys like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. Appreciate those of you that have and your continued support of the show if you're a frequent listener or viewer. Got an exciting episode in store for you today, and I am not riding solo. I am joined by my friend Spencer McLaughlin. He's the host of Locked On Ducks and Locked On Pac-12 and does a lot of awesome work. Frequent guest on the show. Been a little minute, but how we doing, man? Thanks for being here.
Dude, always happy to come on with you. We are doing well. It's June, and yet I can't stop talking about college football.
Yeah, that's exactly how I feel too. You know, football is really ramping up. Recruiting's ramping up. Well, football isn't so much ramping up. A lot of discussion points, but recruiting's ramping up. I'm going to be heading out to the Elite 11 later this afternoon. So excited for that, to see a lot of the top college recruits in the country, high school football recruits. But man, let's talk a little bit about the transfer portal. That's our plan on today's episode. I mean, I think we've been kind of, pretty transparent about it, but sometimes we don't plan these a whole lot because, you and I talk so much and do all these things. We just kind of let it rip.
We're always preparing.
Yeah,
this
we're
is
always
like
preparing.
pick a topic and let it fly.
Yeah, so we're going to be talking about the 2022 and 2023 transfer portal hauls for Dan Lanning and the Oregon Ducks. That's our basis, our focus on today's episode. But before we get to that, I had a couple of small little updates that we wanted to get into as far as recruiting goes. We talked a little bit on yesterday's episode about how Justin Williams, the 5-star linebacker target for Oregon out of the state of Texas, is going to be taking his official visit this weekend. And then you also see that Elijah Rushing is going to be taking his official visit this weekend. So 2 top 5-star defensive targets for Oregon will be coming on campus this weekend. And honestly, I think it's 2 guys that Oregon has a great shot at landing. Spencer, everyone has their attention on that June 23rd weekend, but this weekend, this upcoming June 16th weekend, it's no slouch, and it's going to be a big opportunity for Oregon to make some progress with their top guys.
Yeah, it is, and what we're looking for on the recruiting trail right now is when is Oregon going to land their first 5-star, right? And what position is it going to be at? And I think there's a pretty good likelihood that it'll, or high likelihood, I should say, that it'll come on the defensive side of the ball. Now, as for which guy that ends up being, not sure. The most likely 5-star offensive player would be Brandon Baker, the number 1 offensive tackle out of modern day high school. Oregon just got one of his teammates, Jack Ressler, in the 2024 cycle, 3-star wide receiver there. So I think that's kind of the next big domino is who's the first 5-star? Do you get another one? Do you get 3, right? Because, last year's class ended up with 2, Mateo and Jurion Dickey, but they were really, really close to having 4, right? If Kenny Dillingham doesn't leave, Dante Moore is a Duck. And the whole Peyton Bowen situation, I still don't think anyone fully understands what the hell happened there. And he committed to Oregon and then didn't sign, and then there was, nobody really knows. So I think it's pretty reasonable that Oregon can end up with more than 2, but I think 2 5-stars in every class is kind of the standard now that Dan Lanning and this coaching staff have set, that they're capable of getting at least 2, but why couldn't they get 3? Why couldn't they get 4? Because they basically had 3 to 4 locked up a season ago, and as time goes on, I think you only get better as your results continue to improve on the field as well, and your recruiting results as well. So I look at guys like Elijah Rushing and say, yeah, that'd be a foundational defensive piece. Pair him with Mateo Uyunglele and, maybe Jordan Birch if he comes back. That'd be a pretty elite offensive line. I'd like to see him get a 5-star interior guy. Williams Nwaneri comes to mind out of Missouri. David Stone out of Texas. Those are kind of the 2 biggest fish on the interior that Oregon is after, and I would love to see him get either. Obviously, getting both would be amazing, but Justin Williams is it Justin Williams is the 5-star linebacker and Dylan is the 4-star?
Mhm.
Okay, so, and no relation between those two. It's just out there to confuse us and whatnot. I think those are names at positions that Oregon can certainly stack up on from the high school ranks as well. And I think that any one of the front seven has really been kind of the core of the Dan Lanning recruiting success over the last couple of years, in the secondary too. So that's kind of what I'd be watching for in the recruiting front. So who's the first 5-star? What position is he at? And do any more follow in the immediate aftermath?
Yeah, I think, and we had that one episode, Spencer, where we kind of just talked about how many 5 stars Oregon could land. I think 3 is definitely realistic. 4 is something where it's maybe not as likely, but they're kind of flirting with that possibility. And I think that it's just based off of look at the sheer quantity of 5 stars that they're involved with, because we kind of broke it down in our episode as far as realistic, maybe a reach, like you talk about reach schools when you're applying to colleges and whatnot. So I think that, the 5-star conversation is always a really interesting one that a lot of people want to join that discussion, but there's a lot of quality high 4 stars that they're going after. I mean, just look at the cornerback position, for example, though that's a position that's kind of seen a shift in recent weeks with Dakota Fields pledging to USC, Xavier Brown kind of effectively cutting Oregon out of his top schools, but they're still going after some really talented guys, high 4 stars like Aaron Scott Jr., who just took his OV, Bryce West, another guy out of the state of Ohio that has Oregon in his top schools. So it's really important to strive for those guys, but it's not the end of the world if they can't get them. All that said, the 2 5-stars that are coming to Eugene this weekend, Oregon's got a heck of a shot to make some serious noise with both of them, and obviously hopes to land them at some point.
Is Rushing, and then who was the other one?
The other one is Justin Williams.
Justin Williams. Okay, yeah, the linebacker.
Yeah, Justin Williams. So those are 2 guys. I think Elijah Rushing is a lot more realistic right now. He's kind of winding down his OV schedule, has gone out to Notre Dame recently, Arizona as well. But Justin Williams, I think, is kind of, I feel like he's on that level of Mateo last year, where it's just that could be a huge recruiting win and a massive statement. And then Dylan Williams was just on campus this past weekend. So I think that even though maybe guys aren't coming on that June 23rd week, not all of their guys are coming on that June 23rd weekend. Like, Justin Williams is going to be in Georgia. They're a huge threat in his recruitment. It's not the end of the world. That's still going to be a very big weekend. Guys like Kamar Matudi are coming out. Michael Van Buren, one of Oregon's quarterback commits, is going to be back in town. Just talked to him yesterday. Going to try to get that interview out to you guys pretty soon. So it's a busy, busy time with recruiting. But I thought that would be a cool little segue or intro, because really, when you think about it, Spencer, there's 2 types of recruiting now. You have high school and you have the transfer portal. And I think that it's really interesting to compare the 2, because there's different approaches. Both of those processes move at different paces. Transfer portal stuff happens in the blink of an eye. High school recruitments are oftentimes much more drawn out. But Oregon has once again a very strong haul in the transfer portal ahead of the 2023 season. So I just kind of wanted to kind of pick your brain and kind of have some good discussion about kind of the guys that stand out from both of those respective hauls, and then ultimately kind of trying to work towards a conclusion of which group do we think is going to have a bigger impact, because there were some one-year guys from both hauls. And I think it's important to kind of lay the foundation that maybe that 2022 class, they had some serious guys like Gonzo and Bo Nix and Bucky Irving, those last 2 who are going to have more than one season with the Ducks. So yeah, let's just kind of maybe we could get into the 2022 haul a little bit, or if you had any other thoughts to kind of start this discussion off with.
Well, I think big picture, when you're looking at the 2 transfer portal classes, I think that 2022, and it's hard to know because we haven't seen any of the 2023 guys take the field, of course, but I think you have more high-end production and talent in the 2022 cycle, but I think you have a greater depth of talent and production and guys who are going to contribute in the 2023 class. And what I mean by that is you had Bo Nix, Christian Gonzalez, and Bucky Irving. That's your starting running back, your starting cornerback, who is a first-round NFL draft pick, and your starting, and did I just say quarter running corner? All of those backs,
starters, yeah,
yeah, are not just starters. They were high-end starters, and Bo Nix was phenomenal. He literally set the Oregon single-season completion record. There is a 0% chance that you can bring in a transfer at another position who's as impactful as Bo Nix was in 2022. You can't have it because you're not bringing in another quarterback, and that's the most important, most impactful position on the field. Then you look at the fact that Bucky Irving was, I don't know, really, really good all the time and was Oregon's top running back and leading rusher, went over 1,000 yards a year ago and did a lot of other really, really good things. And that was, kind of after they were trying to figure out. Remember that Georgia game? We saw all 4 running backs, and we thought that'd be the thing. And then Cardwell and Dollars kind of faded, and Whittington and Irving rose to the top and became, a really dynamic tandem. And then Dollars was, kind of the pass catching back in there, which I really liked, by the way. And then Jordan James in the goal line. But I don't think you have those guys necessarily in the 2023 class. That doesn't mean you don't have good players who will make an impact. But, which offensive skill position guy is going to come in and set an all-time program record like Bo Nix did, and which guy could come in and lead his position group in the most important offensive category? I don't see that in this class, though there are some impactful guys to be sure. And then also, which guy that comes in on defense is going to play so well he'll be a first-round NFL draft pick. Yeah. Maybe Jordan Birch, maybe, but I don't see that here. However, I see more starters or regular rotation guys from this class than I do in 2022. There are also just more players overall. There were 10 transfers a year ago, and there are 15 this season, so that's a part of it. But that was kind of the biggest thing that stood out to me, was kind of quality over quantity, which doesn't mean that both didn't have quality and quantity, but I think your quantity is higher in 23, and your quality was better in 22.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting thing to look at, because they also had different needs, going into each of those seasons. Cornerback was a glaring need, and you go to get Gonzo. Literally could not have panned out any better. He was your lockdown cornerback one, ends up going to the first round. And then you get Bucky Irving and Noah Whittington. Not that running back was a glaring need, but you bring in those 2 guys, like, you just talked about, Cardwell and Dollars probably could have gotten it done, but that's not ultimately what ended up happening. So you bring in Bucky and Noah, and they just they flourish. But now you're looking at this year, and you don't have a need in the backfield necessarily. And then you got wide receiver with Chase Cota last year. He was the most impactful wide receiver from the portal that they got. But then you also had Caleb Chapman, who came over from A&M and never really saw the field, didn't really carve out a role. And then in 23, now you have a needed offensive line. So you have to look at those guys as, possible plug and play options, whether it's Johnny Cornelius at tackle or Junior Angelau on the interior. We didn't really get to see much of him in spring. He didn't play in that spring game. So we're still kind of waiting to see, what the Ducks have there. And then you have Nishad Strowther along the O-line as well, a later addition from East Carolina. And I think one of the to your point, Spencer, when we're just talking about the sheer numbers difference, I think that when you saw them take fewer transfers in the 22 cycle, part of it was because of those needs, and those guys, played right away. I think kind of a way to look at this 23 class that they have is that you have some, glaring need guys that you had to get, positions that you needed to address. Most notably probably at the offensive line. I think that's probably where you needed the most help. But then you also look at guys like Justin Jacobs and Connor Soley at linebacker. You needed some help there. Maybe you didn't need as much help as they ultimately got at wide receiver. Like Troy Franklin's your guy, but you also have Chris Hudson and some younger guys coming in. Like, I think that Gary Bryant Jr. was a little bit of a surprise. Not the fact that they got him, but that they, maybe pursued him as hard as they did.
I felt the same way.
Because they already had Holden and Tez. But that's why I think there's a couple guys here in the 23 class that you don't see the same of in the 22 class that were luxuries and not glaring needs. Like the way that they were able to get Gary Bryant Jr. late, I think that was a luxury. The way that you got Strowther late, I don't think that you necessarily needed another offensive lineman, but you wanted to, kind of double down and make sure that you were good. Nico Reed, I think that was another late addition that they kind of would have been all right if they didn't go into this season getting him. But you get a guy like him, got that familiarity with Demetrius Martin, got some good, production at Colorado. And I think that makes you feel even better about your cornerback spot, which honestly, we can both agree was still pretty lacking last year. Aside from Gonzo, I'm not saying it was horrible, but it wasn't nearly at the level that they needed it to be. And when you can add some of those luxury guys, I think that you are, kind of condensing your margin of error and just kind of covering your bases a little bit better, for lack of a better, way to say that.
Yeah, I think Bryant and Reed definitely fall into the same category of you'll take them because they're pretty talented guys and they've been productive Power 5 players in this conference, as a matter of fact, but you're adding them to a position group that I didn't feel like there was a need necessarily, because the receiver room of Troy Franklin, Trayshawn Holden, and I mean, you got Jurion Dickey coming in with Tez Johnson and Chris Hudson, and Kyler Casper's there. I didn't look at that and think, boy, we really need another wide receiver who's a proven entity. Like Troy Franklin, Trayshawn Holden, Chris Hudson, proven entities. Tez Johnson, pretty proven. Kyler Casper, Jurion Dickey, a lot of upside with both of those guys. To me, that felt like enough. But they add Gary Bryant, and I'm like, okay, I'm not going to sit here and say it's, completely illogical or that I don't want to have a talented guy on the roster, because, what if you have cluster injuries? Yeah, you'd like to have guys who are capable of being able to step up. And Nico Reed at corner, I think, was more surprising given how many DBs are in the room. Like, they already brought in Kyrie Jackson from Alabama, who, according to Phil Steele, is preseason all Pac-12 first team. I cannot
That's exciting to see. Hopefully he can live up to that.
I would love if he lived up to that sort of hype. I just didn't have that sort of hype for him, even though he came from Alabama. It was just, I mean, in the spring game, he looked solid. He didn't look like Gonzo or anything like that, but okay, if Phil Steele thinks that, maybe he's right. Maybe we're all about to be surprised on that front. But I look at the room of cornerbacks, not just safeties, but corners, and you had 4 corners a year ago that saw meaningful snaps for the Ducks. Christian Gonzalez, Triquez Bridges, Dante Manning, and Jaleel Florence. And 3 of those guys are back, and you added Kyrie Jackson. Cole Martin looked like, as a true freshman, he could play right away, frankly. But let's assume that, that doesn't happen super often, though it did with Jaleel Florence a season ago. You add Nico Reed, and maybe it's a personnel sub package sort of thing, because I don't know. I don't think I'm alone on this front. I loved what I saw from Jaleel Florence last year. I really think that Florence can become a lockdown corner. And look, Oregon's going to put the best team on the field they possibly can in 2023, but I think Florence's upside is being that sort of cornerback, is being that number one kind of guy, and he has to see the field in order to develop into that for the Ducks, and I think he's already a capable player, but I think he's got plenty of room to grow, and I'm really interested to see where he fits in the depth chart, because last year he was kind of the number 3 cornerback at times. It was Gonzo, it was Bridges, and then sometimes it was Florence, sometimes it was Manning. Like, they, mixed and matched quite a bit a season ago. But with Nico Reed now in the fold, I'm interested to see where, Florence kind of falls here, because I think his upside is really, really high. But I could see the other guys having successful seasons as well.
Yeah, and then that's why I feel like the cornerback spot is one of the positions I'm so intrigued by. Like, we were talking before the spring game, like, oh, who are you most excited to see? I'm like, I want to see what's going on with the corners. And I think that's still the case heading into 23, just because they added so many guys. We still haven't seen Roger Pleasant. We still haven't seen Dalen Austin. But corner is one of those spots that is super, super difficult to break into early on versus, running back. Maybe you see more guys playing early there, as was the case with Jordan James having a big role last year, a bigger role than maybe some people expected. But I think, another spot that we should talk about is tight end, because the Ducks went kind of heavy at tight end in the portal. Bringing in Casey Kelly from Ole Miss, and then bringing in Caden Ludwig from Colorado, who, mind you, played linebacker while he was at Colorado. I think it was just for 1 year. But like, that's another interesting thing to look at when you're just kind of comparing the needs there. I think tight end became a bigger need than Oregon probably expected during the offseason, with the transfers of Maliki Matavao and Cam McCormick. And then you got Terrence Ferguson getting banged up in the spring. So you can kind of bring in these guys that I think, quite frankly, don't have big expectations. I think part of that is because you're feeling good about what you have in Terrence Ferguson, and then Patrick Herbert played his first full season, staying healthy, and you feel good about what you have there. And then you also have Sadiq as well, who looked good in spring. So I think that's another interesting position to look at, because that was an absolute need, but I don't think that the guys that they added there are, guys that you think are going to necessarily be big difference makers, at least as we stand right now in June. Haven't seen either of them play in an Oregon offense.
Yeah, I think it's tough to know like exactly how impactful everybody is going to be, but I think you look at the haul that they've brought in, and each one has, logic behind it, right? You look at each move and say, okay, yeah, here's why they did it. Okay, yeah, here's why they did that. And I think some were more essential than others, but big picture, the tight end room that Oregon has now, it's got enough scholarship capable bodies. I think Ludwig though is a preferred walk on, at least right now.
I think so,
Maybe
yeah.
maybe that'll change in a year, but
You would think, because he's out of position.
yeah, probably. So I think that the tight end room is not exactly what they were going for. I think they wanted Varquise Gums from North Texas, and he chose Arkansas instead.
Twice.
Yeah, yeah, twice. So I don't think that the tight end room is bad. I certainly think it is a step back from what it was a season ago from a depth standpoint, because Patrick Herbert, who's fine, by the way, there's nothing wrong with Patrick Herbert. He's solid. I don't think he's anything special. And he was number 4 on the depth chart a year ago. He's now number 2. Now, maybe he's poised for a big jump, right? Maybe he increases his blocking capability, which was solid but not amazing a year ago. Maybe he becomes a more prolific pass catcher, maybe because he has to. I don't know. But I think with 5 tight ends in the room, you've got enough guys there, and they clearly feel good enough about where each guy can, fall into from a depth chart standpoint. Oregon used a lot of tight ends a season ago because they had a lot of good ones. I would feel better about the room as a whole if we'd kept either Matavao or Cam McCormick. I was pretty shocked that Matavao left, because tight ends are tandems, really, right? And especially in the offense that Oregon was running a year ago, it was a lot of tight end tandems. And I really thought T. Ferg and Matavao were pretty clearly. I mean, T. Ferg is clearly the best. He's an NFL guy. I think he's gone after this year. But they were clearly the top 2 to me. Matavao in the run blocking perspective, and T. Ferg from the pass catching perspective. But T. Ferg is also a pretty solid blocker too. So I liked what they both brought. And Herbert has to, I think, step into that role, because I don't think either Casey Kelly or Caden Ludwig are guys that are going to be, just like plug and play starters, explosive, big time impact guys. I don't think that's why they were brought in. I don't think that's what they're there to do. And look, maybe we just end up running more 11 personnel, 1 back, 1 tight end, and 3 receivers under the Will Stein offense than, what Kenny Dillingham did a season ago, where when Oregon would go 5 wide, you had a running back and a tight end out there. So, often you had, I think, a running back and 2 tight ends in the pattern, and maybe he wants to run more 4 wide receivers. I don't know. But we have to wait and see what Will Stein wants to do on that front. But I think the tight end room is fine. I don't think it's as deep as it was with talent a season ago, but I think they did what they needed to do to be able to hold things over for the offense this year.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. We're not trying to criticize it or say it's not great. But it looks like they're at least going to be able to be serviceable. And you have multiple guys that you can bring in to kind of be that number 2 guy to T. Ferg, which is that's kind of what you want at the end of the day. Another position that I want to talk about that is really interesting to me, and I feel like paints a good picture of how Lanning is attacking the portal, and maybe a key difference between 2022 and 2023 is the safety spot in the secondary, because the Ducks bring in 2 safeties with Tysheem Johnson and Evan Williams. But again, if you're looking at from a numbers standpoint and an experience standpoint, maybe not a glaring need that you think would correlate with bringing 2 safeties. And what do I mean by that? Steve Stevens, Brian Addison played a lot of football for the Ducks. And then you have some young guys with Cody DeCambra, Tyler Turner coming in from this past class. I feel like there's probably some more guys on the actual roster that I can name. But you lose Bennett Williams from a season ago. The bottom line is that Brian Addison and Steve Stevens have played a lot of football. And then you lose Jamal Hill because he's a linebacker now. But the thing that I'm taking away from this is that I just feel like you haven't seen the production from either Stevens or Addison to confidently head into next season without making some additions at the safety spot. And I think that bringing in guys like Evan Williams and Tyshim Johnson's versatility was a huge talking point all of spring football, by the way, just moving all over the secondary. I think bringing those two guys in shows the urgency specifically that Lanning is attacking the portal with. And honestly, on a bigger note, just, there's less of a margin for error. Like, you can take more guys in this 23 class because you have the luxury to do so, but it's also sending the message like, if you're not, panning out or at least being a rotational guy by the end of your second year, kind of like, it's that coaches are forced to make that decision a little bit sooner now. Who are you going to kind of give the benefit of the doubt to and be more patient with, or who do you make that call with? Like, hey, you were here 2 years. We haven't really seen it. And I think it's best for us to, go different ways. And that's kind of a big picture thing. So I'd be curious to get your thoughts on that. I feel like just adding more guys shows that they want to win now and that they have an urgency to get guys that are going to contribute right away. And it's no secret that you're bringing in guys from the portal. If you bring in guys from the portal, you expect them to make some noise sooner than from the high school ranks.
I think you had 4 rotational safeties who played consistently a year ago for the Ducks. Brian Addison, Steve Stevens, Jamal Hill, and Bennett Williams. So those were kind of your 4. So Jamal Hill moves down to linebacker, and Bennett Williams graduates. So that leaves you with 2 from last year's room, Steve Stevens and Brian Addison. I think bringing in Tyshim Johnson and Evan Williams, I thought Tyshim looked good in the spring game. He looked fast. That big explosive hit he had to break up a pass play in the flat. I mean, he identified, triggered, got up, and just really looked disruptive and explosive all at the same time, which I think is what was lacking from the safety room a year ago. And I think when you look at what Oregon got from that position, they are trying to get faster, number one, because they got beat over the top too often. I mean, Bennett Williams was a good player from 15 yards and in, but once you put him in open space time and time and time again, especially at the end of the year, he got burned. He got burned over and over again. He just wasn't that sort of player, just doesn't have that sort of speed. He's effective as a box safety, but frankly, if Bennett Williams had been coming back for another season, I would have said the same thing that I say about Jamal Hill, which is I think bulking up and going to linebacker is where you're going to be most effective, because Williams was a good blitzer. He forced that fumble against Arizona down in the desert of Jaden DeLora. He was a really good tackler. He's a really, really good tackler. One of the best tacklers, according to PFF, on Oregon's team a season ago. And he was okay, not great, but okay in coverage as long as he was kind of around the first down marker or closer. But anything past that, and it's just not where he was able to succeed. So I think the staff is looking at, their safeties room with Tyshim and Evan Williams now, and I think those are going to be your 2 starters along with Brian Addison would be my guess. Addison, I think, is the fastest or most explosive athlete of the bunch. He is a really, really fast guy and is an experienced college football player as well. And I think Steve Stevens is still going to be a part of the rotation because of his experience, because of his leadership. That's been talked about by coaches after practice pretty regularly from what I've heard over the last couple of months. I know you're more on that beat than I am, since I'm obviously not on it at all. But you've been there and heard that sort of stuff and get what I'm saying is, Steve has been around for a long time. He knows playbooks, he knows coverages, he understands, assignments and everything like that. So I think that he still is going to be a rotational player. But if we're being honest about Steve, he's fine. He's solid, but he's not the sort of guy who you'd say, oh, well, he's got a starting spot and you can't take it from him. No, you absolutely can't. If you were a more explosive athlete, if you were just, a more impactful player, I think you absolutely can, move him to a more rotational role, but I don't expect him to get moved out of it entirely. I'd also watch for J.J. Greenfield, who played a decent amount
I
in.
really like him. I think he's
Yeah,
underrated.
yeah. He played a decent amount in the Holiday Bowl, and he looked pretty good in the time that he was on the field. And he's been with the Ducks for several seasons now. So I expect all those guys to kind of be the top safety options this season. But I do think Tysheem and Evan both are going to be two of your primary safeties this year. And Brian Addison was easily your most impactful safety a year ago if you're talking about the back end of the defense and playing over the top. He had a couple interceptions. He had some big hits. He graded well in coverage. I don't remember an instance in which, he got seriously burned last year, whereas I, can think of those sorts of moments with some of the other guys. So I think that's a really solid place for Oregon to be with their safeties, is having some returning production, understanding what these guys did well, moving Jamal Hill down to linebacker, I think is going to work out, and then bringing in guys who you feel can bolster the overall production from that room, because it's got to be better for the Ducks.
We got one more position I want to talk about, and then we'll kind of wind it down with our final takeaways, and we're comparing these two cycles. As long as that's cool with you, Spencer, I think
Yep.
we're cool on timing. So we've talked about a lot of different positions, but there's one guy that we have to hit on before we get out of here in more detail, and it's Jordan Burch. Because I think you and I can both agree he's the transfer that they get with the most hype. And I also think that probably needs to fill the biggest need, which is getting after the quarterback. And I think that when I look at Jordan Burch, I'm not going to say flat out that he can have the same impact that Bo Nix had in 2022, because that just doesn't make sense. The edge rusher doesn't impact the overall game like the quarterback does. But when you're looking at where Oregon has fallen short in recent years and where they haven't lived up to the billing and the potential that they've had, it's getting after the quarterback. So I think that Jordan Burch pretty much has the ability and the need to have the biggest impact from this entire portal haul in this 23 class. And there's a lot of reasons that I think he can do it. You look at Dan Lanning coaching him up, Tosh Lupoi, Tony Tuioti. You look at the depth that he's going to be playing alongside with guys on the interior and on the edge, like Mace Funa, Brandon Dorlus, Casey Rogers, Popo Amavai coming back. Having that talent alongside him is going to just, I think, elevate what he can achieve, because he's not the one guy that you can focus on. I think that last year you had Mace Funa and DJ Johnson, and they were good, and Brandon Dorlus was getting after the quarterback, but when you add more pieces to complement that, it's just making your overall defense so much harder to slow down. So that's kind of the point that I wanted to drive home, is that I don't think Jordan Burch is going to impact the 2023 Oregon Ducks like Bo Nix impacted the 2022 Oregon Ducks, but I think he kind of could fill that void and just have that kind of an impact and a difference on the defense, and just filling a glaring need, because that's what Bo Nix did last year. They had a need at quarterback. Things were not working out, especially with the guys that they had on the roster. So if you bring in a guy like Jordan Burch, I think, he's hopefully tailor-made for this defense, and he can really help this defense take it up a notch, like we've talked about with some of these other pieces that they've added from the portal on defense.
Yeah, and hopefully that'll have a reverse effect as well. Brandon Dorlus grades very, very well in PFF and NFL draft circles, as he should, and I think he passes, our eye tests as fans as being an above-average defensive lineman, and I think that, he's only going to be freed up more by the emergence potentially of Jordan Burch or of Mateo Uiagalelei. If you put all of those guys, someone was commenting on one of my shows earlier today about the possibility of having kind of a pass rush package along the defensive line, and you slide Jordan Burch to the interior, you put Dorlus in there, you have Mateo at one edge and Mace Funa at the other. I do think that is probably a lineup that includes Oregon's 4 best pass rushers, and you can put them out there because Burch, is an edge player but can play on the inside, much like Brandon Dorlus, who moved back and forth a season ago. I think Dorlus is stronger on the interior because he doesn't quite have that, kind of bend around the tackle speed the way that you think of like a Kayvon Thibodeau or other great edge pass rushers have to get after the quarterback. But his moves, his footwork, his handwork especially, is as good as any interior Oregon offensive or defensive lineman that I can remember. He's really, really good. And he can bull rush guys too, but he is just so, you don't say it about a defensive lineman a lot. He's so crafty and smart, and he's a very heady player. And I think he understands angles incredibly well and how to, get an offensive lineman off balance, set him up for one move, make him think you're going this way and then go the other way. And he has that kind of, burst of quickness, not necessarily speed, but he kind of has that, quickness and agility to work really well on the interior. And I think if you line him up there, Birch at one edge typically, and put Casey Rogers in the middle to swallow up a double team maybe, or Taimani or Popo, and then Mateo or Mace Funa at the other edge spot, I think that defensive line is just massively upgraded from what they had a season ago. And I hope that Birch can have the sort of impact that we need him to. But really, I just am looking for production from the whole unit to kind of, improve from where they were a season ago.
But then you also have a lot of these 23 guys that we haven't really even got much of a look at. Blake Purchase, Gatorade Player of the Year out of Colorado.
Ashton Porter,
Terrence Green. You have
Mari
a lot
Washington,
of guys. That aren't even
and frankly, on the true freshman max, I'm not expecting to see a lot of them on the field unless it's kind of a blowout, because I just look at the depth that Oregon has, and aside from edge, I see. And at one edge spot, I see a two deep pretty clear, and I don't know how a true freshman could come in and be that sort of guy. Maybe Purchase. I know you've been really high on him for a long time coming out of Colorado. Maybe he's your fourth edge guy with Birch, Mateo, and Mace. But when you look at the interior of this defensive line, unless you have a special player, all those prospects, Terrence Green, Amari Washington, Ashton Porter, they all project as good Power 5 starters, but who are they replacing on the interior? You know what I mean? Like, take Amari Washington and Terrence Green. Could both be really good players on the defensive line for the Ducks one day if they reach their potential. But in what world is a true freshman who's, not a 5-star recruit? These are 4-star guys, so it's not as if they have zero hype. But unless you were like a world-beating talent, or you blow everybody's expectations out of the water, who are you replacing? Because you're too deep on the interior right now. Looks like Brandon Dorlus, no one's touching him. Casey Rogers, started all of last year. Sam Taimani, and Popo Amavai. Like who are you knocking off? You know what I mean?
Yeah,
so
definitely not in 23.
Yeah, not in 23, but in 24, opportunities will be more plentiful, because I think Taimani will be done. Dorlus will be in the NFL. I think Casey Rogers will be done too. So that's why I think Oregon, recruited so smartly in the 2023 cycle, having all those interior guys, and doing the same thing in 2024, because they see the writing on the wall the way we do, which is you're going to lose a lot of guys from that particular position group. But for this particular season, I don't see, any true freshman outside of Mateo able to get reps unless it's at the edge position. So maybe Tatum Tuioti pops, or Blake Purchase, or I think Ashton Porter can play defensive end. He's not necessarily an edge player, which is a hybrid outside linebacker, but he could be, a defensive end in certain situations. So maybe one of those guys, but overall, I think the defensive line's pretty clear, and I think the true freshmen are, going to have to wait their turn, but that's okay, because they probably need to get in the weight room anyway.
Couldn't agree more. Yeah, we definitely have a lot of the same, viewpoints on that. We'll end it on this, Spencer. So I think we kind of agree, but I really do feel like the 2022 portal haul is going to have a bigger singular season impact. I think those guys in 2022 will end up having a bigger impact on what the Ducks did in 2022 than the guys in this 23 portal haul will have on 23. I think that's kind of where I'm at right now, in terms of just a lot of guys that filled immediate needs. And then, like we talked about, some of those luxury additions, kind of what we were calling them, guys that they didn't necessarily need really badly, and maybe their path to playing time is a little bit more murky than some of those guys from 2022. And then also you have a lot of multi-year guys in this 23 haul. So I think that that's not saying that the 22 haul is better than Oregon's 23 haul. I think I just wanted to try to, come to some conclusion on that question that we posed at the beginning of which one is going to have a bigger singular year impact, which one's going to be more impactful. I tried to kind of narrow it down to 1 year. So I think I'm going 22, but I really like the guys that they added in 23. And you do have some of those guys that are going to need to fill immediate roles, like Justin Jacobs at linebacker and then Jordan Birch on the edge. And then I also think that some of these guys at safety are going to carve out a spot pretty much right away. So that's kind of where I'm at. Is that where you're at? What kind of final thoughts do you have here
Well, I have many thoughts, Max, all the
on
time.
this particular topic?
I always have many thoughts all the time. No, I think we're in pretty lockstep agreement here that I think Oregon's in a better place. We have to see it on the field, but I talked about on my show recently that, on paper, this is a better Oregon roster, and the portal classes definitely factor into that. I think the 23 portal class, there are just a lot of unknowns, right? You go down and you see the talent and the star rankings and whatnot, but Nico Reed, how much does he play? Nishad Strother, does he play on the offensive line? Is a Johnny Cornelius a starter? Is Junior Angelau going to play on the interior? What about Connor Soeli? How does he factor into the rotation? Not a super highly, coveted transfer portal prospect. Is Kyrie Jackson a big pop? I think there are just so many unknowns, and the only knowns I feel like we have for this year's portal class are Trayshawn Holden and Tez Johnson will be big parts of the offense. Evan Williams and Tyshim Johnson will be big factors on the defense. But everybody else, there are questions, there are position battles. There's still kind of an unknown factor there.
Yeah, I feel like you think Justin Jacobs is probably a pretty big piece of the linebacker core on defense.
I'd like to think so, yes. The unknown I have with him is health, right? He's basically Justin Flo without an extra star. That's what he was at Iowa. Brief glimpses, looked really good, but was never healthy.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, I definitely think that he's going to be a huge part of that defense just because they have so few options there and not as much depth as I think that they would ideally have. But we'll definitely pick up this conversation again at some point, I bet. But we're getting a little long here on this episode. So before we get out of here, where can people find more of you and your work?
Yeah, my work is Locked On Pac-12 and Locked On Ducks on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcasts, free and available Monday through Friday all year round. And I'm on Twitter at Smalls_55. If you ever want to shoot me a note on there, DMs and mentions are wide open as we record this. I've got about 15 notifications to respond to on Twitter about realignment because everybody's popping off right now. So if you want your conference realignment fixed, I'm talking about that basically every day, because that's what the people care about over on Locked On Pac-12. But Max, always great to be on with you, man.
Yeah, appreciate you coming on, Spencer. You guys make sure you tap in and lock in with Spencer. If you want to find more of me, you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at mtorresports. Like I said, going to be at the Elite 11 all week. No Oregon quarterbacks. Michael Van Buren and Luke Moga did not earn invites, but I'm going to be there covering a lot of the greatest future football stars. So super stoked about that. Subscribe to my YouTube channel at Oregon Football Max Torres. Check me out writing the latest and greatest in Oregon football recruiting on ducksdigest.com. And then lastly, share the show. Share the Ducks Dish podcast with your friends, with your family, and with other Duck fans. Greatly appreciate your guys' support. And until next time, thanks so much for taking some time to talk some ball. You've been listening to another episode of the Ducks Dish podcast.